The year is 1947. The young doorman remembered the beautiful young woman with the raven hair, dressed all in black, with 2 white dahlias carefully placed behind each ear, because she turned her head and smiled before walking around the corner and disappearing into oblivion. My name is Linda Paris, and this is History, Mystery, and Murder. Tonight, the gruesome murder of the Black Dahlia. At 10 a.m. on January 15, 1947, Betty Bersinger bundled up her 3-year-old daughter and left her Los Angeles home to pick up a pair of shoes from the cobbler. As she strolled down the sidewalk, passing by a vacant lot, something caught her eye. At first glance, she thought the large white objects laying a few inches from the walkway were pieces of a broken store mannequin. But as she approached the scene, she stopped. Betty's mouth slowly opened in an expression of disbelief. Suppressing the urge to scream, she wasted no time. Scooping her daughter up in her arms, Betty turned and ran as fast as she could to a neighbor's house, where she phoned the police. When the police arrived, they discovered the nude body of a woman who had been severed in half at the waist. The corpse was lying face up, and the scene looked to be deliberately staged. The arms of the upper torso had been placed over the head, and they were bent at a 45-degree angle. From the lack of blood on the ground, the color of the body, and the various other clues that were left at the scene, it was clear that the girl had been killed elsewhere and placed in the vacant lot some time later. It looked to the officers as if she'd been scrubbed clean, and her hair was still wet from being washed. The lower half of her body was positioned a foot over from the torso, emphasizing the dismemberment, and the legs had been spread wide apart in an effort to degrade the victim after death. The body appeared to have been drained of blood, which was highly unusual in the detective's experience. This indicated that the murderer had access to a special location where the fiendish killer could live out his ghoulish fantasy in private and not be disturbed. The intestines had been removed and tucked neatly under the buttocks, but it was the injuries to the girl's face that caused the investigators to scratch their heads and circle the body continuously. The coroner would later describe the massive injuries in medical terms. Quote, a deep laceration to the face, 3 inches long, which extends laterally from the right corner of the mouth to the right ear, and another deep laceration 2.5 inches long, extending laterally from the left corner of the mouth all the way up to the left ear. The coroner further concluded that the surrounding tissues were bluish purple in color. The horrifying report went on to say there are multiple lacerations to the mid-forehead, in the right forehead, and at the top of the head in the midline, and multiple tiny abrasions, linear in shape, on the right face and forehead. He added, quote, there are 2 small lacerations 1/4 inch each in length on each side of the nose near the bridge, and further there is a depressed ridge on both sides in the anterior portion of the neck, which is light brown in color. What this means in plain English is this: the victim was clubbed on the head several times with extreme force until she was knocked unconscious. While she was passed out, her killer secured her head in a rusty, vice-like contraption, most likely of his own design. This is what left the deep impressions and orange-brown coloring on either side of the victim's nose and on the back and sides of her neck. The use of such a device suggests that the killer had planned to slash the victim's face while she was still alive all along. The marks on the girl's body indicated that wire or heavy rope had been used to restrain her legs, arms, and lower torso. She had been in a sitting position, her legs sticking straight out, back upright, arms on either side and elbows bent at a right angle. After immobilizing the victim, the killer viciously tortured the girl for an untold period of time as she looked into his face. The autopsy revealed a litany of mutilations, and it was noted that feces was found in her stomach. She had been punched in the mouth so hard that most of her teeth had been loosened. The most harrowing aspect of the autopsy was the fact that the cause of death was shock and hemorrhage from the deep slashes into her face. Elizabeth Short, though alive, was barely conscious and nearly dead when she was completely cut in half. This killer, however, was not yet satisfied, and he continued to abuse the corpse long after her death. A psychological profile developed by William McCreary, a famous FBI profiler, suggested that the killer became enraged when the victim, quote, died too soon. This also strongly suggests that the killer knew his victim and had a personal score to settle. It was important to him, after the murder, to go the extra mile and show her as a whore. More than likely, this killer enjoyed the fact that a woman and a child had discovered the body. His efforts had garnered him 2 additional victims in the bargain. They would never forget what they saw that day. At first, no one had any idea who the woman was, and she was mistakenly described as a teenager in the initial newspaper accounts. Because of an arrest when the victim was still a juvenile, the authorities quickly identified the woman as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short from Medford, Massachusetts. Elizabeth's sister, Mrs. Virginia West, 25, told reporters, quote, "She was always being told how pretty she was. I guess it just went to her head." Elizabeth, known to her friends and family as Beth, was described in the newspapers as a pleasure-loving adventuress who was, quote, movie-struck and, quote, man-crazy. Her friends said she wanted to get a good job but never had one. The autopsy revealed that Beth Short bit her nails and had teeth that were rotted, untreated, and filled with wax. Beth was hiding the truth from her family, and her mother was shocked when told of her daughter's circumstances. Quote, "I never dreamed she was having financial difficulties," Phoebe Short later told reporters. Lynn Martin, one of Beth's 2 roommates, stated, quote, "She was very good looking, with beautiful dark hair and fair skin, but she was broke and hungry most of the time," end quote. In 1946, Veronica Lake and Alan Ladd starred in a huge box office hit called, quote, "The Blue Dahlia." Elizabeth's friends subsequently nicknamed her the Black Dahlia because of her fondness for sheer black clothing, her dark beauty, and her raven-colored hair. Beth would often place a flower behind her ear, further identifying with the film. By all accounts, when Elizabeth Short entered the room, heads turned. In spite of all the attention she enjoyed, Beth had reached an all-time low. On a personal note, I learned about the Black Dahlia's murder at a very young age. My father and my grandfather were policemen. My dad graduated the police academy in 1949, 2 years after the Black Dahlia's murder. One night, I overheard them talking about the case, and I listened from my bedroom, fascinated yet horrified, as they described the scene and debated what had happened to Beth. When I later asked my granddad about the story, he looked down at me and put his arm around my shoulder. Quote, "Honey, you don't need to know anything about that," he said. "That's not a story for a little girl. She was a pretty gal who had too many boyfriends, and that's all you need to know." His message came through loud and clear, in spite of the fact that he avoided the details. Girls with too many boyfriends could end up like Elizabeth Short if they don't watch out. In fact, I never forgot about the story of the Black Dahlia and became obsessed with it over the years. Who was Elizabeth Short? What was it that triggered this killer's rage? What really happened that night? What were the facts that led up to this hideous crime? I discovered how much misinformation is out there about the murder and Elizabeth Short herself. Mysteriously, the entire police file, which was stored in the LAPD archives, had been stolen or lost over the years. Gone. At some point between 1947 and who knows when, the files simply disappeared. This fact has made it even harder for researchers to get to the truth of what happened that terrible night. For instance, there is a poignant story that is taken for fact and has been used for decades to determine a timeline leading up to Elizabeth's murder. Almost every account of her movements on January the 9th states that she was last seen leaving the Biltmore Hotel on that Wednesday evening and never seen again after that. This led to much speculation that she was held somewhere for 5 days and tortured before being left in the empty lot. The bartender and 3 witnesses stated that she was at the Biltmore Hotel and waiting for her sister, who never showed up, at 6:30 p.m. on the evening of the 9th. Harold Studholme, chief bell captain at the Biltmore, stated that Beth left the Biltmore after stopping to chat with him, and he last saw her walking south on Olive Street. Harold recounts that she turned and smiled and waved at him, then walked around the corner and disappeared into the night, never to be seen alive again. The problem with that story is, when I received the district attorney files on this case in 2006, the timeline is clear. That was not the last time Elizabeth Short was seen alive. According to the DA's report, a lot of things happened after Elizabeth left the Biltmore. With over 100 suspects questioned, including a wealthy lesbian from Hollywood circles, to say the investigation was seriously flawed is an understatement. After she left the Biltmore Hotel, Elizabeth went to the Crown Jewel Cocktail Lounge at the corner of 8th and Olive Street. She chatted with the bartender and several patrons before she headed back to a rooming house where she was staying with friends. From the 11th to the 14th, the night she disappeared, Elizabeth Short was seen daily by many people, all renting rooms at the Astor Hotel, located at 2901 South Flower Street. Elizabeth had been headed in that direction when she left the Crown Jewel Cocktail Lounge on the 9th, probably around 9 or 10 p.m. that night. Elizabeth was never kidnapped and tortured for 5 days, as is commonly theorized. The DA's files, which contain some of the original police reports, set that record straight. The question still remains, though. Who is Elizabeth Short? And how did she end up so badly butchered and carefully posed in an empty lot? Elizabeth Short was born in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, which is a working-class suburb of Boston. Her father, Cleo Short, was reportedly an entrepreneur. There is some dispute as to what kind of business he owned, and others report that he had invested in a putt-putt golf business, which was booming during the Industrial Revolution, as so many people were enjoying success. Whatever Cleo's business, it was hit hard by the Great Depression. Cleo had moved his wife Phoebe and their 4 daughters to Medford, Massachusetts, anticipating that his business would enjoy continued success, when in 1929 the stock market crashed. Shortly afterwards, Cleo vanished. His car was later found parked by a bridge near the family's home, and his death was ruled a suicide. Cleo's body was never found. Cleo had left Phoebe and the 4 girls to fend for themselves during the worst financial depression in American history, and taken the easy way out for himself. Phoebe did the best she could. They downsized, moving to a much smaller place, and the women endured. Phoebe and her girls loved the movies and used the magic of Hollywood as an escape from their hardships. Beth was shaping up to be a spectacular-looking young woman. She talked incessantly of going to Hollywood and becoming a motion picture star. As it turned out, growing up, Beth looked more mature than she actually was. Her friends and family encouraged her to do something with her looks, as they felt she could, quote, make it on her stunning appearance alone. When Beth was 18 years old, she stayed with a family in Miami and worked as an usherette in a movie house for the summer. The year was 1940. Beth only had 7 more years to live. It was during this period that Phoebe Short received a letter that would shock the entire family. Cleo was alive. Cleo had the unmitigated gall to happily pen a letter to Phoebe stating that he was, quote, alive and well, and boasting of his job in a shipping yard in Northern California. He boldly asked if he could return to his family so that everything could be the way it was. Phoebe, who was revolted by the news, told him she wanted nothing to do with him. However, in 1941, the word California ignited visions of Hollywood and dreams of becoming a star for young Elizabeth Short. So at 19 years old, Beth packed her belongings into a steamer trunk and headed for Vallejo, California to live with Cleo. Beth's reunion with her sociopathic father, Cleo Short, didn't last long. As if a man with a heart would have left his wife and children to fend for themselves during the most frightening economic crash in the country's history to begin with. His character was defined before Beth ever left the airport. By all accounts, Cleo was a raging narcissist, not a father, but a user. But the story of Beth and Cleo doesn't end there. You might say that Beth's murder could be directly laid at Cleo's doorstep. At least that's what I say. Is it any wonder that Elizabeth Short would develop a disdain for men? Elizabeth's killer was extremely brazen and went out of his way to degrade Beth at the crime scene. He took risks, driving her body to a secondary scene and then remaining there and posing the corpse in a public place. Witness Bob Meyer reported seeing a black Ford sedan pause where the body was found and noted the time at 6:30 a.m. The body was placed only 12 inches from the sidewalk, and a witness who had passed by earlier stated that he had not seen it there at the time. Apparently, no doubt because of her situation, Elizabeth Short was not always honest and had a tendency to lie about things. She was also described as self-centered and egotistical. Betty was referred to as conceited by many of the friends and acquaintances who were interviewed later. Time after time, this issue was raised by the people who knew her best. Betty was a narcissist. Betty was cruel to men. She was even described as a mooch. There's no doubt that Betty relied on others to take care of her. Why does this matter? It matters because it's part of the story and you can't leave it out. It goes to motive. Cleo didn't want Beth to pursue an acting career and would do nothing to help her in that regard, in spite of the fact that his suicide charade had permanently damaged his daughter's self-esteem. He insisted she stay at home and keep his house for him, an arrangement that was never going to work for his beautiful young daughter. One can project that Beth had little, if no respect for her father as time went on. Naturally, the sailors stationed at the shipyard where Cleo worked were clamoring to ask the stunning 19-year-old out on a date. Cleo did not like his daughter's popularity, and he insisted she stay at home. There were bitter disputes between the two, and most likely Betty did not allow Cleo to forget his faked suicide, an act that had forced the women to fend for themselves as he lived the life of a bachelor. Betty left her father's house and hitched a ride with a friend to Camp Cook, an armored training base near Santa Barbara. She took a civilian job at the Army PX as a cashier. This qualified her to live on the base, but the Army base was new and still under construction. Elizabeth was later named Camp Cutie of Camp Cook. Her roommate advised her, though, to be very careful of the men she may run across. Civilian cutbacks forced Beth off the base. She finally found a place at a ranch located nearby. Beth was later arrested in a restaurant having drinks with a table full of friends because she was still a juvenile. It was this arrest record that the police would use to identify her body in 1947. At this time, characteristically, Cleo refused to take custody of his daughter. Beth now had no legal guardian. However, she was again taken in by a kindly female, a Santa Barbara police officer, before being returned to her mother in Medford. But it was only a matter of time before Betty found herself back in LA, cruising the hotspots, searching for that big break that she knew was right around the corner. After the murder, when the newspaper reporters contacted Cleo, he blustered and shouted back that he wanted nothing to do with it. Later, he would tell one persistent reporter that he wanted Elizabeth to come to California and clean house for him, but she wouldn't stay home, so he threw her out of the house. Although her grief-stricken family would never get over the loss and spoke often of Elizabeth, Cleo Short, the man who faked his own death and left his family to fend for themselves during the Great Depression, seemed eager to erase them all from his life yet again. But his daughter's murder would follow him for the rest of his days. Who planned and butchered Elizabeth Short and carved a gruesome grin into her face, and why? Most likely there are only two people who could give us that answer, and neither are able to talk today. Meanwhile, theories abound, and the mystery abides. Who really killed the Black Dahlia?